Ben Smith, media columnist, New York Times. Really good to be with you, man.
Thanks for having me on.
So let me just start off by asking you kind of the obvious media question, which is that, you know, the media always gets the short shrift. People are never saying they love the media. But right now, in the midst of this massive crisis, I saw a Gallup poll that said that of all the American institutions grappling with coronavirus, the news media is given the worst approval rating. So as the guy whose job it is to sort of assess and understand the media, why do you think that is?
So I've got, a bunch of different excuses for this. And this is less of an excuse, but just a reality. These numbers have been bad for a long time and getting worse and worse. As, Americans' view of a lot of institutions has gotten worse. And a big part of that is a deep partisan divide. There's the Republicans dislike and distrust the media. Democrats like it much more. Donald Trump has really deepened those and made, his whole presidency about an attack on the media. And I think, and that is part of what's being reflected. I also think, though, that we bear our share of the blame. I think, the American media right now processes every story. And when I say the media, I think my head and a lot of people's head goes to cable news. For a lot of people, if you say, do you trust your local blog? Do you trust your local newspaper? Do you trust your local public radio station? Your favorite local weatherman? They mostly say yes. But when you say the media, you're thinking cable news. And I think cable news processes a lot of these stories as political stories. And that really proved particularly wrong in this moment. For Fox News, which I think made this really catastrophic mistake in late February, early March, that meant saying the main story here is another partisan attack on Donald Trump.
So all the talk about coronavirus being so much more deadly doesn't reflect reality.
Democrats, what do? They want to use a deadly virus as a political weapon against the president.
This is yet another attempt to impeach the president.
Even if you think the criticism of him was unfair, which they do, I don't, it obviously is not as important a story as this global pandemic. And I think, a lot of the rest of cable news processed new information as see more evidence that Donald Trump is a terrible president, which, again, may be true, but not the big story.
But not the story, yeah, because if you think about the crisis now, and this is, without question, the biggest crisis since World War II, the crisis is not the president. The crisis is this horrible global virus. And the news organizations are going to be the place where, in a crisis, people are getting their information from the folks that they do actually really trust, the doctors, the scientists, right? That's what they should be doing. And I guess what I hear you saying is that part of the problem is that the media organizations aren't actually widening the aperture suitably to cover the whole story. Instead, they're still spending too much of their time focusing on Trump.
Yeah, and it's not easy to widen the aperture away from Trump. He's this incredible gravitational force. He's basically a television producer who's making lots of highly entertaining content for us all. And his decisions really matter. The mistakes he's made, are going to wind up having massive consequences. And it's not just Trump, right? It's partly just, it's in a big national crisis. Nobody is saying, we have a big national crisis. What does the governor of Washington say? People do want to know what the president has to say. He was so feckless in his public appearances in those early days that there was this, I think, both sense of, gosh, maybe we should totally tune him out, but also, oh my God, what's he going to say next?
You've said that these news organizations, shouldn't take the bait. But, you also wonder, when President Trump is having a press conference and, he's literally attacking those journalists directly.
You've said repeatedly that you think that some of the equipment that governors are requesting, they don't actually need. You said New York might not need 30,000. You said it on Sean Hannity's Fox News. The question is, how is that going to impact?
Excuse me, you didn't hear me. That's why you used to work for the Times and now you work for somebody else.
Mr. President, my question is...
Don't be threatening.
Because, that's kind of where he's getting the media juice and play from doing it. They all just jump on it. How do you avoid that?
You can't totally avoid it, but I think it's basically a matter of proportion. You have thousands of reporters, hundreds of reporters, dozens of reporters, however many you got. the biggest story in the country is not President Trump being a jerk to a reporter. It's this pandemic. And that doesn't mean you don't cover it. It doesn't mean you don't also kind of understand why he's doing it and the kind of show he's trying to put on, why this is working. Because those are important stories, but probably not the biggest story today.
There's even been talk about, from some of the, folks that really don't like him, maybe we shouldn't be covering his live press conferences every day. And of course, before they were saying he's not giving us any press conferences. He's not talking now, of course, surfeit of riches from that perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky question. And what's the ideal sort of way for the media to behave as a piece of public health infrastructure rather than as, an entertainment network? And I'm sure none of us are doing it perfectly. I find that debate a little academic. Rather
than just Trump, I mean, like here in New York, right? I mean, the other figure who's become a national figure, indeed, because New York is now the epicenter in the United States of this crisis, is Governor Andrew Cuomo, who also is hosting his daily press conferences. They're not competing on time slots, certainly, and I'm sure that they wouldn't want to. But he's handling it very differently, right? I mean, talk a little bit about, because they both are getting a massive amount of attention, and they both have very strong support bases. They don't overlap very much. How do you compare the strategies that have been taken here by Cuomo and Trump?
Well, I mean, they're very different people. Trump is this media figure who's basically arranged his whole career around media and around television. Cuomo, is a guy who's not particularly loved, not even particularly liked, more feared than anything else in New York State. But all of the things about him that I think drove a lot of people crazy, his bullying, his micromanaging, his corniness, are incredibly well suited to this moment. And I think he has this sense of total command, and it's not fake. He is incredibly versed in where, every lever of government, how you get every member of the state assembly to do whatever you want them to do, where all the state troopers are. Like he's a massive micromanager, and a bully who can force people to do things and ram things through and knows how to get that stuff done. And I think people find that incredibly comforting in a moment when nobody else seems to know how to get things done.
Now, talk a little bit, I mean, this has not just been an issue of coverage of the U.S. political system. It's also been an issue of different narratives, radically different narratives, different countries around the world. I mean, there is effectively a disinformation campaign going on right now from China in terms of their lack of responsibility for the initial outbreak of this. And indeed, though it's not getting a lot of coverage right now, again, with the crisis, but your news organization and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal all had their journalists kicked out of China. And by the way, the New York Times had some of the more sympathetic coverage out there in terms of the Chinese piece of this story. Talk a little bit about the disinformation campaign and how you read China versus the U.S. in all of this.
Yeah, I think this is a huge and mostly undercovered story, because when people talk about disinformation on the internet, often they're thinking about posts telling people to drink bleach, and the social platforms have been pretty good at stamping those out. But there is this, high-level argument going on where I think China is putting a lot of energy into painting. It's sort of essentially saying that, look, these democracies can't handle a crisis, and look how great we're doing. I mean, that's and we are the model. That's sort of the underlying message. But it's included some really kind of outrageous misinformation from official government spokesman. This guy Li Zhangjiao on Twitter is obviously
the foreign ministry spokesperson.
Yeah, foreign ministry spokesman who tweeted this just ridiculous conspiracy theory about the virus having been, I think, started in the U.S. And the Chinese government was getting, I think, really fair coverage from Western outlets, which both pointed out something that wasn't at that point a secret in China, which was how horribly they had mishandled the outbreak. And then also, I think, humanized the victims in a real way, including the heroic doctors and nurses, and then covered the Chinese response as they got their acts together pretty fairly, even in a situation where obviously we doubt their numbers. And I think what you see is that they are not open to that kind of nuanced, fair coverage and want to totally control the story.
And so as the New York Times, as one of the organizations that has just taken it on the chin, and you no longer have anyone on the ground in the second largest, soon to be largest economy in the world. How does that affect the way you think about that coverage, your ability to do it?
I'm glad it's not my job to run that coverage because and I would hate to speak for those folks. I think it's a huge challenge. I do think on the most sensitive China stories, a lot of the best reporting has come on, particularly the Uyghurs, has come out of places like Turkey because it's so locked down on the ground. And what you saw in the coronavirus crisis is the Chinese government kind of lost control. And reporters were able to talk to doctors and nurses and regular people.
Right in Wuhan.
And those people were so angry that they were not as worried as usual about telling the truth.
There is no vaccine available for this virus, but you are suggesting that you think the social media companies are actually doing a reasonable job in covering this crisis. You think that people are generally getting pretty good information about the science of all of this.
Yeah, they're certainly not perfect, and there's so much happening on social media that I think it's hard to control, but they're acting with a kind of confidence about truth and falsity that you just rarely see from those companies. I think there's a lot of hand-wringing when politicians say racist things, inflammatory things in the United States and elsewhere about what is censorship and where can the social media platforms intervene. You've seen none of that here. They've been deleting tweets by, for instance, the president of Brazil when it contains misinformation. They're getting a kind of clarity of guidance from the World Health Organization that engineers really like. This is the sort of situation that people running Facebook and Twitter really were built for, and Google to YouTube. And I think there's a question of, are there lessons here that you can translate back to the world of politics? I think the answer is probably not. And what you're seeing play out in these geopolitical disinformation campaigns is that as confident as the platforms are about deleting a tweet from the president of Brazil about coronavirus, they're not going to delete that Chinese foreign ministry spokesman spreading basically political disinformation.
Well, because they know what a fact is. When it comes to science, they have a harder time with that in anything that looks like politics.
That's right.
And not to mention the fact that the economic consequences of doing so for them are problematic. But the other side of this, of course, is that the tech companies are some of the very few winners in all of this, right? 6 months ago, we were talking about, Elizabeth Warren was talking about needing to break up these big tech monopolies. Now, with most of the U.S. economy on its back, the one thing we know is that we desperately need these tech companies, right? You can buy from Amazon, you need your Google, you need your Facebook. Do we come out of this with vastly stronger tech companies with control over personal data that is just completely beyond the pale of what we ever thought we were going to be dealing with?
I think the tech companies' critics made a lot of gains over the last couple of years, and they will still have to react to some degree to those. But I think when you end this and you're talking about what are the trusted institutions and what are the distrusted institutions, I think the government failures, the polarization around the media, is going to leave a situation where Amazon was this incredibly functional logistics network for the country in a crisis. I don't know. Would you have trusted the federal government to keep up the supply chain? Maybe. And the social networks, for all that they're polarizing, are also keeping people connected. So the platforms like the one we're using right now, Zoom, are pretty miraculous. So I do think that the tech companies are likely to emerge from this with even more power and with their kind of hegemony even more secure in ways that we're going to be reckoning with for a long time. And
so here you are. You're up there in Columbia County, New York. The quality of your work seems just as high as it was when you were in your office. The New York Times, you guys are putting out this news. It seems pretty good. I wouldn't have noticed that you didn't have all these people in a big shiny office, Midtown New York City. That's pretty expensive with a lot of infrastructure and other labor around it. When companies realize that they can do that, aren't they going to reduce their physical footprint a lot coming out of this?
I think it's an open question. It's never been efficient to have a newsroom in New York City, right? I think a lot of companies were obviously doing that for reasons that had to do in part with attracting talent. Maybe the New York Times is going to shut its newsroom, but if then somebody says to me, hey, one of the perks of your new job is going to be, office where you can see people, I might take that job. So I'm not sure.
Oh, Ben Smith with a message directly to the leadership of the New York Times. Very nice. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Ian.